I still go to the hospital, but 34 years ago, when I went there in '66, as soon as I entered the hospital, I was struck by strange, motionless, transfixed figures, some of them in very odd positions, standing in the lobby and the passages. I'd never seen anyone like this. I'd seen catatonic patients on the back wards, but this was obviously something different. And I was very amazed and horrified when I found that some of these patients had been there for 30 or 40 years, that the hospital had been opened in 1920 for these first victims of the epidemic sleepy sickness, the encephalitis lethargica, and that medicine and surgery apparently could do nothing for these patients, and that further, many of them had been dumped there by their relatives, or their relatives had died, and in effect they had been abandoned and had been out of the world for decades. I'd never really heard of this sort of situation. There'd been very few accounts of such patients, although one account referred to them rather dismissively as extinct volcanoes. But, you know, the nurses and others who knew them well, and I came to feel this myself, were convinced that there were intact minds and personalities inside these petrified bodies. I wondered whether these people, rather than being extinct volcanoes, might be dormant, and whether both the possibilities of health and of disease, in a way, were smouldering in them. So what would happen if you uncap them? And also, what would it be like for someone whose life had been severely dislocated with a discontinuity? We can't, you know, for better or worse, we live our lives from day to day and year to year. We can't imagine this sort of suspension. What would it be like for these people if they did awaken, if they did come to? And I hesitated for 2 years before I tried any medication. There were astounding things. One patient especially stays in my mind. She was actually made the subject of a play by Harold Pinter. But when she came to, she was tremendously animated, but in a strange way. She had the speech and the gestures of a young woman from the 1920s. She looked like a flapper come to life. She spoke about Gershwin as if he was still alive, and I wondered, you know, where she was. And I asked her some questions. She was a very bright, quick woman, and she said, I know the date of Kennedy's assassination. She says, I know the date of Pearl Harbor. She spoke of these things as sort of flashbulb memories, but she indicated there'd been no sense of coherent living. She says, I know it's 1969. She said, but I feel it's 1926. I know I'm 64, but I feel I'm 21. And in some sense, she had dropped, as through a vacuum, from the 1920s to the 1960s, from her 20s to her 60s. She said she didn't like our world very much. She said that everything which had had meaning for her had vanished. And after 10 days of the strange 1920s animation, she went back into the state she had been before, and nothing we could do. No, this wasn't the case for most of the patients, but I think with her, the challenge of coming into an alien world, in an unfamiliar world, and making a new identity was too great. And so, I mean, the Awakenings was as much an existential as a medical. On the one hand, there was all the physiological side effects and this and that. I think some of the relatively short action of the medication and some of the way in which it activated other symptoms. Well, this was one set of problems, but the other was to be reactivated, to be awakened and put back into operation, after being out of operation for 40 years and feeling oneself sort of outmoded. There had been an account in early 1967 of the effects of L-DOPA on people with ordinary Parkinson's disease. and it was touted as a sort of miracle drug. Now, one of my patients, in fact, the original Leonard L., who was somewhat different from the movie version, a very bright man, he was the one who drew my attention to this. And he spoke of dopamine, the neurotransmitter needed in the brain, as resurrectamine. He spoke of Coetzee, the physician who had introduced L-DOPA, as the chemical messiah. You know, one sees the depth of intelligence and hope and irony and desperation here. Well, my patients did have Parkinsonism, Parkinsonian, certain clinical features of Parkinsonism, but they didn't have ordinary Parkinson's disease. I'm sorry, this sounds a little confusing. The Parkinsonism for them was part of a much more complex, strange, long-standing disease. And because of the complexity of the disease and its duration, I didn't know how L-DOPA would, how they would do with L-DOPA. I think it couldn't be known. When the patient started declining, I felt bewildered, anxious, sometimes guilty. I didn't know what was happening. I tried all sorts of ways of restoring or retrieving the original response. And at the same time, I think, of perhaps preparing patients for what might be some continuing, but now only partial and less dramatic response. I think finally it was probably accepted by all of us that some sort of decline was perhaps a physiological necessity, maybe associated with the amount of damage there had been to the nervous system, and the fact that one was perhaps trying to stimulate the 1 or 2% of cells which remained in certain systems to do the whole job. The contrary to the movie, which in a way shows everything as ending in 69, many of the patients made accommodations, and some of them lived 15 or 20 years afterwards, at least with sort of a partial animation. And but it was as the person who gave the L-DOPA, I tended to be invested by them with, almost with too much hope and power, and then they got angry with me or whatever. One of the patients said that L-DOPA had become Hell-DOPA. Very, very complex business, morally complex, medically complex. And the medical life is very complex, perhaps, and it's maybe sometimes these existential and ethical complexities which make me look back wistfully, as it were, to the days of physics and chemistry, when there were all sorts of intellectual challenges and sometimes torments, but not quite these particular existential or ethical ones. One of my fellow speakers, who has done and is doing beautiful major work in genetics and has a fine scientific mind, also said that he spoke of his belief in a caring personal God and the supernatural, and he said that he saw no incompatibility between these modes of thought or forms of belief. They didn't seem to be in two compartments of his mind. And there was something about the reiteration of the word supernatural, which made me take issue with him and explode a little bit. And I said that that for me, I thought there was and always had been an incompatibility between a belief in the natural world and anything else. Indeed, I could not imagine a supernatural world, and that I thought any belief in the supernatural was similar to a belief in the occult, and therefore that I found what he said in a sense unintelligible. I think I forget exactly what I said in the heat of the moment. I said that for myself, beside scientific interests, I had a passionate feeling for music and for art and for the beautiful, and sometimes for the sublime, and that I thought that I had experienced feelings of the sacred and the holy and the religious, and yet for me this was all part of being a human being and of the natural world. And I couldn't imagine, I didn't see the sense of positing anything supernatural, although I saw why it might be done. I think I also indicated, I wanted to indicate my respect for believers. Amongst other things, I work in an Orthodox Jewish hospital and also an Orthodox Catholic hospital, and I usually don't take issue with with people. I feel it's partly their business. But since this actually came up before an audience, I did take issue with it. I like Dickens. I think the first big book I ever read was A Tale of Two Cities, and the first piece I ever wrote was called Recall to Life, which of course is the title of a section in A Tale of Two Cities. I loved Dickens' London, and I think the London I grew up in still sort of had many Dickensian streets and scenes and feelings about it. I was very fond of H.G. Wells, especially the early stories, yes, H.G. Wells especially, and I think even now, 55 or 60 years later, so many of H.G. Wells's images and metaphors come to me. When I visited the island of the country blind, when I visited the island of the colorblind, I thought vividly of H.G. Wells as sort of the country of the blind. I liked Alice in Wonderland, but I also liked a charming book called Mr. Tompkins in Wonderland. This was written by George Gamow, a physicist, and he tries to bring relativity and quantum theory to life by imagining, say, that the velocity of light is only 10 miles an hour, so that then bicycles become flattened by relativistic contraction, and the quantum is so large that it becomes visible. So I think probably points at which science and imaginative literature came together always pleased me. The first biography I read, I think the first scientific biography, was Madame Curie. My mother, who was a surgeon, worked at the Marie Curie Hospital. She'd met Marie Curie, and who was one of her great heroines. And reading the book was, I think, was the first portrait of a scientist and the romance of a scientific life. It was something which was a great pleasure. Rather recently, there was a centenary celebration of the Curie's discovery of polonium and radium, and I mentioned this book and how important it had been for me. And as I did so, I saw an old lady beaming in the audience. And I looked, she had high Slavic cheekbones. Anyhow, this was Eve Curie, who had written the book. So she came and signed it for me 65, 60 years later. She's in her mid-90s. And this gave a wonderful sense of, historical reality. I've never liked textbooks very much. I always wanted to read biographies, original accounts, letters, journals. I wanted to try and feel and imagine what the discoverer was doing. And I love travel books. I love sort of Captain Cook's travels and all the travels. My father was a general practitioner, and when he was 90, we pressed him to retire, and at least to stop the house calls. And he said that he'd give up everything else, but he'd keep the house calls. But as a boy, I used to go with him on his house calls, and I partly now regard my life as house calls in a sense. I don't think you can get any idea of what people are like by just seeing them as a sort of abstracted specimen in a clinic or hospital. You need to see them at home. The general practitioner hasn't existed here for 50 years, but he exists in England, he exists in Australia, he exists in Canada. I think he's needed, and I think he's going to come back here. I didn't experience or notice much turbulence until 1939, when the war broke out. I was just 6. Before that, I think there may have been a somewhat pampered existence. My parents were both busy, but the house was sort of, I had my elder brothers, and there were nurses and nannies and cooks and others. But then, when the war broke out, I was evacuated and sent away from the family, like 3 or 4 million other children. And I spent 4 years at a boarding school in the country, probably a rather abusive boarding school, and seeing very little of my parents. And that was a very bad time for me, a bad and almost a mad time. When I came back to London when I was just 10, I developed a violent passion for chemistry, as you see from my tie, and in general the physical sciences, where things seem to be orderly and predictable in a way which human beings weren't. Although this was also to some extent in my family, because although my parents were doctors, my mother was the 16th of 18 children, and 7 of her 9 brothers were chemists or geologists or mineralogists, and so there was a strong feeling for physical science. And 2 of my uncles, really one a chemist and one a physicist, were crucially important for me in those post-evacuation years between about 10 and 13. And I found those years blissful. I was out of the hell of evacuation, and I hadn't yet entered the turmoil of adolescence and of deciding what to do in life. And it was also a period of playfulness. I was doing classics at school, but the interest in science was something secret and private. And later, when I did science at school, I didn't enjoy it nearly as much. In general, I didn't enjoy school. I enjoyed museums, botanical gardens, libraries, laboratories, where one was immediately in contact with. I'm not fond of schools and textbooks. My mother was an emergency surgeon in the war, and my father was also very busy, and we, their sons, had been sort of scattered around, and travel wasn't that easy. In retrospect, there was probably a psychological error here, but parents were put under great pressure by the government to send their children to safety, and it worked out very well for some people. I think that some sort of trust and ability for closeness may have been compromised, and I think I've perhaps to some extent sort of kept a distance since that time, although this is not a distance I feel with my patients or my students. I think I can be sort of very close there in the context of a professional relationship. But I think something about bonding and belonging can be affected by this. But I think I've also been very lucky with, both with people and with interests and things, and it's nonetheless, I think, been a rich life. Was I rebellious? No, I think I was probably too compliant. Although when compliance became intolerable, I exploded. So I think there have probably been alternations of compliance and explosion. But But mostly, I don't like either term, and I would like to think that some autonomy, some quiet, strong, calm autonomy is possible, which is neither compliant nor defiant, but being oneself. I mean, it's what one struggles to be or become all one's life. I think this is partly why I came to the States 40 years ago, because it was a new place, it was empty. I didn't have, I have, beside my 3 medical sibs and my medical parents, I had like 90 first cousins on my mother's side. There was too much family. I needed to get to a less populated space. I saw it soon after I'd come back from this chaotic and really awful period in the country, and the periodic table with its arrangement of all the elements in a sort of beautiful vertical and horizontal way seemed to me just a wonderful. Although I knew the periodic table was a human invention, I thought this is the way the elements organize themselves. This is the way God thinks. This is a cosmic order. And the beauty of the table and the sense of it affected me greatly. It corresponded with everything in chemistry. Of course, one didn't know why the elements should have the characters they did or why they should be related. Mendeleev, who made the table, didn't know, but I was sure that things would be confirmed later, as of course they were. But the periodic table stands for me for, as it were, the beauty of scientific truth and scientific construction, and also the beauty of the natural world and the way in which simplicity and number, at least, seem to command the physical world. I'm sure that I'd seen it in books, but the one which stays in my mind was the big periodic table in the Science Museum in London, which was a huge mahogany table, and it had samples of all the elements. And I love stuff. I love chunks of metal, and seeing the great chunk of bismuth and iridium and the yellow crystals of sulfur and the sort of waxy phosphorus and iodine subliming near the top of the bottle. So that was a most joyous epiphany, I think, in the Science Museum. I loved museums. I spent all the time I could in the Science Museum, the Geology, the Natural History Museum, Kew Gardens. I fear for museums now becoming too jazzy and interactive. I think they need to be places of quietness where you just feel at home. You're under no pressure. You're not forced to interact. I think I may have both somehow accepted that I would be, but fought against the notion from an early age. But certainly on the way, I very much wanted to be a physical scientist, a chemist first. And then I very much wanted to be a marine biologist. And then I very much wanted to be a physiologist. And rather belatedly and reluctantly, I sort of became a physician. But when I did, I somehow realized it was what in a way, I had been moving towards all the while. But yet I'm glad that I made the long journey of wonder through the physical sciences and biology. So I think it wasn't, an immediate sort of bleeding heart feeling, although obviously sympathy and empathy are there, but I think somehow a journey of wonder which finally came to people. My way of studying the brain as a clinical neurologist is not to stick electrodes in it or to do brain imaging, although of course these may be necessary, but to see the impact of various diseases, various forms of damage on the person. One can learn one sees a tremendous amount this way. I mean, for example, although we get a sort of seamless picture of the world, there are 40 or 50 subsystems visual subsystems, and one would have no idea of their existence were it not that one or two of them might be knocked out. Someone might become totally colorblind or motion blind or something else. So on the one hand, I plot the person's ability to construct a world, a visual world, a moral world, or whatever, an intellectual world, on the basis of the brain functions and their compromise. But equally, I'm very much concerned with people's ability to continue life or to renew themselves or to reconstruct themselves in their lives in other ways, so that even if, let us say, color vision is lost, the black and white world can then become heightened and enhanced. And there may be a heightened sense of contour and boundary and texture and tone and movement and depth and everything else. So for me, this is a way of seeing how people and brains construct worlds and construct selves. I think my parents were puzzled when I finished my training, and I was 32, I went into a chronic disease hospital institution, and I think my parents were both rather surprised at that, because their contact had especially been with patients in the real world. But at that point, I think I needed to see people who had spent much of their lives in institutions of this sort. I think when I got deeper and deeper into contact with my awakenings patients, they saw that this was a different sort of medicine, different from theirs, but romantic in its own way, dedicated in its own way. So I think they were sort of worried. I remember when my first book came out, Migraine, on the day of publication, my father burst into the room. He was trembling, he was ashen, he was holding the Times in London. He says, "There's an article about you in the newspaper." There's an article about the book. And although the article was a very nice article and sort of said kind things about the book, my father was actually somewhat shocked, because the notion was that as a doctor you should have a low profile, you shouldn't publish. And for years after that, I always misread the word publishable as punishable. And there was quite a lot of ambivalence. And again, I wasn't sure myself of the proprieties of telling the stories of my patients. And even though I would get formal consent, this involves an exposure or a disclosure. I mean, this is, I've had this concern all the time, but I can only hope that if one writes with appreciation and delicacy and respect, then it's okay. I have to say that I've written 100 times as much as I've published, because if there's any thought of offence or embarrassment, then I will put the thing quietly away. Well, I don't know whether I'm prolific or not. I have sudden sort of convulsive periods when I write very quickly, and then dry periods when I don't. And one writes different things. I've always liked keeping journals. Recently I was in Mexico with a botanical expedition. Botany was one of my old loves. All of the old loves seem to be coming up, the chemistry, the botany, the mineralogy, and I kept a journal there. I think journals basically are my form, my genre. They are the stories of journeys, whether they're physical journeys, clinical journeys, intellectual journeys, nautical journeys, whatever it is. They were my earliest reading and writing, and I think they continue. Although I'm on staff at universities, I don't have that much to do with my colleagues. I see patients by myself, I write by myself, but they're often very intense relationships with patients. But I do think of it as partly a solitary enterprise. And I'm sympathetic to other solitary enterprises. One of my scientific heroes in the old days was Faraday, and I sort of love reading his journals, and having the feeling of just this man in love with his subject, intimate with his subject, and not being pulled into collegial relationships. I mean, he wasn't hostile, he wasn't competitive, but I think in some deep sense he was a loner. And I think this may be true of me as well, for better or worse, better and worse.